today I would like to open a dossier on a question that seems for most of us to be somewhat a solved problem, but I think it still lies at the heart of the enterprise of the New World Academy and any other initiative or institution that would like to consider the political importance of art. This question is, can art be political? I mean here art in the largest sense of the word, including pictorial, literary, time-based art forms, architecture, and so on, music, performance. Can art be political? First, we need to separate the question, can art be political, from the question whether art can be politicized. I think that ever since Walter Benjamin's call in his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of its Technological Reproducibility, to respond to the threat of the aestheticizing force of fascism to politicize art, we can answer this question at least with a provisional yes. Yes, art can be politicized. I think we have seen examples of this. Please allow me to read the last paragraph of Benjamin's text, which I think is still extraordinarily contemporary. So this is the last paragraph of The Work of Art in the Age of its Technological Reproducibility. May there be art, and may the world perish, says fascism, expecting from war the artistic gratification of a sense perception altered by technology. This is evidently the consummation of art for art's sake. Humankind, which once in Homer was an object of contemplation for the Olympian gods, has now become one for itself. Its self-alienation has reached the point where it can experience its own annihilation as a supreme aesthetic pleasure. I think we see this all the time. I mean, I'm pretty sure that if I would have a television and see CNN broadcasting on the destruction of the typhoon in the Philippines, that these would be extremely aesthetic images. You know, although it's terrible destruction, but there is something in the mode of representation that aestheticizes it, which allows us to consume it, obviously. We don't see literally dying people, we see, you know, terribly destroyed cities and so on that look like movie sets. Such is the aestheticizing of politics as practiced by fascism. Communism replies by politicizing art. In his essay, Benjamin links the politicization of art to communism, which is a valuable relation to inspect within our current context, which partially comprises an artistic practice supported by the Communist Party of the Philippines. Of all political ideologies of the 20th century, communism has been most successful in thinking art as an inherently political practice. We can of course point to the fascist art of Mussolini or Hitler, or in fact to the enormous amounts of mass consumption culture that surrounds us as an extension of neoliberal ideologies. But following Benjamin, it is in these latter two cases, we are not looking at art, but rather at an aestheticized form of politics, or, as Guy Debord suggested some time ago, we're looking at the spectacle. On the one side, we find ourselves in the society of the spectacle, which continuously attempts to close the gap between the last very few remainders of avant-garde art and a mass popular culture that in no way is edifying, I would say. And over on the other side, we find the uncoordinated attempts to render art political, mainly by certain philosophers, critics, movements on the fringes of Western civilization, or what we would like to call Western civilization, and theoreticians sensitive to certain aspects of communist thought. I'm sure you're aware that recently there has been a number of conferences on communism in an attempt to try to think, you know, how do we think ourselves out of the mess we got ourselves into. Whereas the aestheticizing of politics seems to be a natural phenomenon in our current times, it seems that of the two alternatives that Benjamin gives us, politicizing art is the far more difficult one to realize. That is, it is difficult in a sense that there is no unitary or unified approach. So let us inspect closer that which in art allows it to be politicized. For Benjamin, the inherent reproducibility of material art forms, such as photos and films, allows for mass education and emancipation. That was his idea, that, you know, film would you know, because it can be multiplied and multiplied and multiplied, it can potentially reach everyone, educate everyone. Any attempt to limit their dispersal to all of mankind should be considered to somehow act against the essence of the photograph or the film. Photograph and film, and for example, types of newspapers, blogs, and so on, are essentially reproducible. In this fact, we also find the paradox inherent to the absurd attempts to protect the reactionary idea of copyright on the internet. The internet allows essentially for anything on it to be infinitely reproduced, and with the advent of the cloud, stored for an infinite amount of time, or at least, you know, as long as the servers don't break down. Whereas individual objects, such as hand-bound books, unique paintings, sculptures in churches, do not openly propagate the reproducibility, photos, films, blogs, and so on, do. Therefore, the actions of WikiLeaks, of hacktivism, for example, or open source movement, are in fact what Benjamin would share under attempts to politicize art, insofar as that the barely material carriers of information, and what is information other than generalized art, are essentially reproducible. So, what Benjamin calls the politicization of art, that is, making art political, has to do with inspecting artistic materiality, the basic matter of artistic works, grasping that materiality, words, objects, sounds, structures, and discovering and highlighting that aspect of it that, in Benjamin's terms, communism ought to propagate in order to elevate the masses, in order to educate the population. This has nothing to do with advocating this or that aesthetic form. It is not even aimed against abstraction or other forms of what is sometimes considered by dogmatic communists as reactionary art. So it's really not about the content. To repeat Benjamin's example of film, what is essentially emancipatory or communist about films or photographic images is that they can be infinitely reproduced and therefore are potentially available for everyone. They resist the idea of the original. A sculpture can exist only in one place on one time. A photographic image can exist everywhere. Elaborating this quality within society is politicizing it. Some art forms can therefore be easier politicized than others. So not all art is equally political. And at the same time, it seems that what communist politicians, or Marxists, or Leninists, or Stalinists, or Maoists, or Hojists, and so on, consider to be political, that is, communist art, may turn out to be nothing of that sort. Until now, we have considered the idea of politicizing art, but we have not at all touched upon the question whether art can be political. The question, can art be political, does not merely imply that some qualities of the artwork, such as its reproducibility, could possibly be read as consonant with a certain political project. It implies that certain qualities, if not all qualities of the artwork, are part of a political enterprise. So the entire work of art is political. We find this idea, which certainly goes against the grain of Benjamin's subtle argument, in the work of Lenin and later in Mao Zedong's talks at the Yan'an Forum. Whereas for Benjamin, in his reading of Marx, the very idea of politicizing art is by necessity driven by communism, condensed in the formula, aestheticizing politics is fascism, politicizing art is communism, we now encounter communist ideas about art in Lenin, in Mao, that would make a differentiation between, on the one hand, properly progressive art, proletarian art, revolutionary art, and on the other side, reactionary art, bourgeois art. Thus, Mao introduces a contradiction within artistic production, revolutionary versus reactionary, whereas in Benjamin, we see an opposition in terms of the mediation of the contradiction between arts and politics. In his talks at the Yan'an Forum, Mao opens by approvingly quoting Lenin as having solved the question for whom writers and artists should work. The immediate answer to the question of the artist's political engagement should be the millions and tens of millions of working people, end quote. However, this answer, which returns in many variants throughout Mao's lecture, does not answer our question whether art can be political, even though it assumes that this is the case. Mao merely answers the question, can art serve a political purpose? The answer is, of course, yes. By arguing that the question, for whom, and this is the first part of his lecture, is the fundamental question, a question of principle, Mao calls for an art serving only and an immediate political purpose. But this is nothing but the result of an aestheticizing of a political practice that is precisely the same thing, if we follow Benjamin, that fascism is doing. The question of form is addressed in the second part of Mao's lecture, when he approaches the question of how. We arrive here at two very vague suggestions, namely first, popularization, that is, in the end, a sort of maximal dissemination of the work of art among the masses. This suggestion approaches Benjamin's idea of the reproducibility of the artwork as an index of its potential politicization. So we can think popularization with Benjamin, that kind of works out. However, the idea of raising the standards, the second principle, immediately relates to a certain ideological content, namely that only revolutionary artists and writers can make revolutionary works of art. I would like to state openly my disagreement with Mao here. He reduces any artistic practice to its only material cause, namely human life. And this conviction leaves no space whatsoever to think in which way an artistic practice may actually shape the life of an artist. Revolutionary political convictions are no guarantee for revolutionary art, nor the other way around. So I would like to separate these two. I don't think it is such a unitary approach can work. Perhaps Mao's argument fails here, because in his analysis, the contradiction between bourgeois, reactionary art, and working class, revolutionary art mainly coincides, or seems to coincide, with Benjamin's opposition between, on the one hand, irreproducible art forms like painting and sculpture in churches, and on the other side, photography and film, which would allow for politicization precisely because of the reproducibility. And indeed, on the side of Mao's working class art, we find precisely aesthetic forms such as folk songs, murals, newspapers, folk tales, as pointed out in Woki Miranya's lectures, even effigies we can share under this that operate in a sort of democratic way that are reproducible. Right? So Mao misses somehow the point that the aversion of bourgeois artists to folk art may not lie in the fact that they are symbols of working class culture, but that they are in fact aesthetic forms that allow themselves to be reproduced, are democratic in nature, and so on. So this is, I think, this may be the problem in Mao's Yunnan lectures, that there's not a clear distinction between, on the one hand, how the forms of art are different, and what the political inspiration of the individual artist would be. In other words, although the initial opposition between art forms set up by Mao might seem reasonable, the conclusions that follow from it are not. For I do not believe any painting of a large portrait of Mao hanging at the entrance gate of the Forbidden City is communist just because the convictions of its no doubt revolutionary painter were communist. It remains utterly reactionary in its placement, form, and medium, even though Mao exhorts his communist specialist artists to look at reproducible art forms, such as newspapers and songs of the masses. Somehow the entire cult of portraiture developed under the different forms of communism worldwide must have slipped through the mazes of no doubt very strict ideological scrutiny all specialists were subjected to. So, and this I actually, do we have this small, can I borrow this just for a second? Because I was reading, and this, why am I talking about this? Because I think that what is happening within the examples from the Philippines that we have been noticing, there is this inherent critique going on to Mao, which, however, I have not heard explicitly expressed. So I think this is a point maybe which we can discuss. Because, for example, when I read in Erickson Acosta's a very interesting interview here. then I really do not see how we can reconcile what he says here with the text of Mao that's in the same book. So what he says is, some people think, this is on page 102, some people think that revolutionary or progressive art must be dogmatic, that all music must bear the signature of a march, or that paintings should always be painted in red. But no, the groups of cultural workers are in fact incredibly open to all influences, especially as they concern employing the mass line and understanding what the masses are consuming and familiar with. So here there seems to be this anti-dogmatic approach, which however does not truly appear, I think, in the Yan'an lectures. Then the other thing that I think is still present here in Ericsson's lecture, in Ericsson's interview, is that you always start reasoning from the position of ideology, right? And I never read somebody reasoning from the position of art. What does a painting do as a painting? You always start on the other side, namely, how do people perceive a painting, and then you suggest what a painting should do. There's never thinking from out of, the fact that, for example, forms like effigy production are inherently democratic, and that is actually what gives them their revolutionary force, right? It always is, we need to have an art form that is available to all masses, and then we resort to effigies. But I think it's a little bit more complex than that. Mao's ideological mess-up of form and purpose, if I may use this very reductive shorthand, has had unexpected consequences in many left-wing thinkers. And I think here we move a little bit more to a Western discourse. Perhaps most of all those who advertise themselves as Maoists. We in fact have a few Maoist thinkers in the West here. For example, just one example, small example. Even though Badiou, maybe some of you are familiar with the work of Alain Badiou, he still considers himself a Maoist. He is one of the major French philosophers at this very moment. And his entire work is an attempt to, how do you put it, to save the idea of a revolution, however, avoiding some of the problems that I have pointed out in relation, for example, to Mao, in the sense, how do you do a revolution when there's no central figure, for example. For example, even though Badiou's philosophical enterprise is remarkable in its rigor and emphasis on a certain decisionism, which is very close to Mao's ideological framework, his treatment of art seems on the surface radically different. The artists that feature in Badiou's work on aesthetics are without exception the big names of modernity, the breakers of paradigms, the revolutionary artists such as Webern and Beckert, Mallarmé and Celan. All of them terribly bourgeois, and from a Maoist point of view, maybe even reactionary artists. This choice of big names is driven by Badiou's idea of art as a truth procedure, namely art in itself producing certain truths, just like politics. Even though this idea, namely that art and politics are separate fields, so to say, is already present in Mao's Yan'an talks when attempting to rehabilitate the importance of art vis-a-vis politics. I mean, this is what he does. I mean, I think this is a virtue of the lectures, at least within communist thought, is that what Mao does is he asserts again a certain independence of the artistic discourse. The outcome in Badiou in terms of which art is considered revolutionary, that is, operating in the wake of an event, is really quite different. But in spite of the formal constraints that Badiou develops, we may still see, now and then, an upsurge of this very conflicted view of art we find in the Yan'an talks, where on the one hand, there seems to be the idea that, yes, the artist must always operate by himself in an artistic discourse, and only if it also succeeds there, it will have value. And on the other hand, but it should be also ideologically correct. So there's this conflict there. So, as a last, kind of tacky example, the cover art of the French edition of his second Manifesto for Philosophy features a digital rendering by the French artist Monique Sobienia, who previously also made a long series of portraits of another philosopher, Jacques Derrida, and images of Madonnas, so a very wide variety of topics. Her work in Badiou's otherwise very strict and philosophical work is praised in terms, and I quote, powerful architecture of lines, an unedited thought of color, and a dreamlike underlying landscape, whereas we clearly see bad Photoshop art. At best, these words sound like a cliché, an attempt to pull an artistic gesture, which is neither revolutionary in its content nor in its form, into a philosophical framework that resists it. They leave us with the uncomfortable feeling that something else is going on in Badiou's thinking about art, a thinking that has not yet fully been able to get rid of, its rooting in a thinking where the content of the artwork and its form are still in a conflictual relationship, because obviously there's nothing, grandeur, there's no amazing break with form as in Mallarmé. It is really very banal, and somehow these two works operate in the same discourse. Even though in his formal philosophy, Badiou disconnects artistic practice from politics, his own convictions betray something else. There's still a desire to have the content of artistic practice somehow reflect the situation on the ground. It's like having your cake and eating it too, right? The world in its supposedly political, or for that matter, philosophical reality. That is, he is driven in the end by the same desire that art can be political, that it can fully reflect the world, that it can make an unambiguous statement about it, that it can pose the question, can art be political? This weekend we will be confronted with this question many times, but we should be wary about where it comes from. As far as I'm concerned, or at least this is what I've come to realize over time, the question itself, can art be political, is a symptom of a politics that tries to aestheticize itself, that employs art as a mode of bringing its point across, whether that is a doctrine of neoliberal capitalism, revolutionary anarchism, or Maoism, or and so on, and so on, and so on. Therefore, I suggest, in preparation for tomorrow, to abandon this question and ask ourselves the opposite question. What is so political about art?